So I'm here with Dr. Ellen Quigley, who is the Senior Research Associate at Cambridge Centre for Existential Risk and Advisor to the Chief Financial Officer for Responsible Investment at Cambridge University. So, Ellen, we all know that investors are coming under sort of increasing pressure to reflect climate views in the way they invest. And I mean, through your roles, you've really seen this up close. And you've recently written a great paper which is called Universal Ownership in Practice, a Framework for Asset Owners. And you say in that paper that in its current guise, responsible investment just isn't fit for purpose. So why do you say that? That's quite a strong statement.
It is a strong statement, but we don't really have good evidence that a responsible investment as it's currently practiced has had much of an effect on company behavior or the ways in which companies contribute to externalities like climate change or inequality. So the issues that responsible investors want to do something about. So right. If there isn't that evidence that there, and also both of those problems that I just referenced are getting worse.
Right, okay, so prima facie there's a case for saying it's kind of not working. And in the paper you distinguish between ESG or environmental impacts that have an impact on the company and those where the company has an impact externally. Can you just say a little bit more about how we should be thinking about those?
Yeah, I mean, right now ESG or responsible investment is usually used as a financial risk tool. So looking at the risk that climate change, say, poses to a company or to a portfolio, as opposed to the impact that a company or a portfolio may be having on the real world. And I think that deserves to be picked apart a bit because actually there's a feedback loop there, obviously. If a company and your portfolio are contributing to externalities that will cause costs to be externalized that will then come back on your portfolio and the company's, doesn't really make sense. It's actually not a very good way of managing the risks to your portfolio in the end.
And in terms of your role advising a significant asset owner, is the asset owner really genuinely interested in both of those dimensions these days?
Absolutely. I mean, the CFO who I advise, he says that the university is an impact organization. Right. I mean, actually, if Cambridge were if it were trying to profit maximize, it would do a lot of things differently. So it is an institution that's trying to have an impact on the world, trying to educate people and solve some of the world's biggest problems. So it's kind of natural that you'd be trying to have an impact rather than trying to avoid risk that you can't really avoid anyway.
Yeah. And as part of the analysis in your paper, a bit that I really liked was the way in which you looked, when looking at it through this lens of having real world impact, you looked at the different ways that different kind of asset classes could have an influence. And that's kind of quite interesting because we often think about responsible investment through an equity lens, whereas actually in your paper you say that's kind of probably the least effective asset class. But could you just kind of pull out some of the key highlights across asset classes?
Sure, and when I say the least effective asset class, I'm thinking about exclusions or tilts, the usual approach to kind of asset allocation or selection of securities. And that's because if you sell a share to me, the money that I pay you goes to you, not to the company. Right. And that's not, if the company actually wants new cash, what they're going to do is they're going to go issue a bond or get a bank loan or maybe IPO or get an equity issuance, although those are both rarer. So it's much more, is there demand for that? And that will affect pricing. And how much you can raise, whereas us exchanging that share, the company doesn't really care.
So that's a key difference between primary and secondary market activity, I guess. And then how do you see the differences between, for example, equity, debt, venture financing? What are some of the key differences that you draw out there?
Well, the additionality varies hugely there. So venture capital would have the highest additionality from the evidence that we have. So when there's a lot more cash flowing into venture capital, then that makes the biggest difference. It's the volume isn't as available for that because it's risky and so on and so forth. And when you look at bonds, I mean, we've been living in a weird bond world for a while, but there still is evidence that if you have more demand, it's going to make it easier to raise more money and at a better price. And of course, if you don't have much demand, because let's say your investors think that you're contributing disproportionately to climate change, then you could end up paying more and be able to raise less. Public equity, I think the word investment is a bit of a problem, because people think that they're contributing to a company when they invest in it. And in public equity, it's just not that common to raise very much new cash. And yeah, that's something we have to think about. But there are other tools available in public equity. They just also tend not to be the ones that we think about too much. I was quite surprised to see that shareholder resolutions appear to be less effective than I had assumed in terms of changing company behavior. Whereas I suspect that voting against the re-election of directors and telling them why is more likely to produce results.
And I mean, there is evidence around engagement, isn't there, as being effective?
Well, okay, but it's not actually as effective as I thought based on doing a review of literature. It's
effective, but without kind of huge impact, if you see what it is, isn't it? It's
yeah, well, I mean, it's been able to... There's some evidence that suggests that it's been able to improve performance. There's some evidence that suggests it's been able to get better disclosure. But yeah, in terms of those real-world outcomes, actual indicators linked to things that change in the real world, the evidence is a little sparse. That said, we aren't seeing a lot of investors using the spikiest tools. So voting against directors is, I think, just starting to come up as something people are more willing to do. And that does look to be producing kind of a greater response on the part of the company.
When we look at what's needed on climate financing, I mean, there's a sort of a big chunk of activity that's in this sort of grey zone about how commercial it is and what the risks are, and that kind of falls into the blended finance area where we might need multiple parties and investors and NGOs and governments and who knows what. What are the prospects for greater institutional investor activity in that segment of the market?
I'd say you really have to blend it. Most of the asset owners they're probably some of the most regulated entities in the financial sector. And so they really are, their fiduciary duty is...
we can't expect us to take crazy moonshots on...
No, I mean, sovereign wealth funds, different. Apparently they have quite a different risk appetite, so that might be a good place to look without the need for blending, but you'll need things like government guarantees and so on for pension funds, because they have to be able to pay back their pensioners, period.
And I guess this links onto a final topic I'd like to cover with you, which links this question of fiduciary duty and how asset owners who want to have impact kind of reconcile it. And I mean, the example I wanted to use is the one of climate change, because we've had a lot of asset owners signing up to the objective of 1.5 degree warming. And I mean, although I'm not a climate scientist, my reading of it is that that's kind of a fairly remote possibility. So you certainly wouldn't say it's the most likely scenario now, which is probably more like 2 degrees-ish, maybe, 2 and a bit even. So if you're an investor then, and you're sort of investing behind a 1.5 degree world, whereas 2 degrees is most likely, and actually universal owners can't really affect that because it depends on what Chinese and Russian and Indian governments do, then that's potentially suboptimal asset allocation, right? So I mean, how can asset owners sort of think about this? Should they just carry on kind of, in a very bullish way, just investing behind that scenario, even though it's quite unlikely, or do they pull back, but then of itself kind of contribute to making it less likely? How do you reconcile all of that as an asset owner with fiduciary duty?
It's a really good question and very complicated, and I think there are probably a variety of different ways you could think about this. One thing to start with is that there is a really big difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and the closer we can get to 1.5 degrees, the better by so many measures. And 2 degrees, some of the last few years, research suggests that it could really be quite catastrophic. So, even getting to 1.7 or whatever, every little bit helps. But that doesn't properly answer your question. I just feel like that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. I think that there are a couple of ways of thinking about this. So one is, if you are taking kind of a portfolio decarbonization approach, which is not my preferred approach, on the basis of having looked into the research on this, then you could argue that there could be some losses coming your way. I think that if you take a universal ownership approach in the way that I advance in this paper, you would actually not touch your public equity holdings.
Right.
You would keep those as they are, and then be much more aggressive as an engager in how you behave. And that's where the greatest return implications are going to be. So if you were to stock pick a lot and have all these fancy tilts and some of them don't really do anything, on the public equity side, then I think you probably could see some pretty significant losses. But the whole point of universal ownership is that you go down with the ship. So you would retain all of that anyway. But in the other asset classes, that's where you would have exclusions if you were trying to have a maximum impact. And there, the return implications are fewer. You can cut quite a bit out of your bond portfolio, and it's not really going to affect too much, especially new issues, right? So it's just not going to really affect you that much anyway, even if we're far off the mark. But I guess the final point to make is that actually, if you think about the power that asset owners have on their own, it's already quite significant, but especially if you start to consider the fact that they are the clients that fund managers are most keen to keep, and that actually, if they were to deploy their power over fund managers, they really do account for a majority of every listed company and so on and so forth, right? So you actually, I think you could start to see the needle being shifted a bit in material terms. And I also think then that makes it more likely that the governments that we really need to enact legislation are more likely to come along, because the more large companies are already complying, like kind of pre-regulation.
Yeah, it makes it easier.
It makes it easier. And also then it starts to affect things that are like imported from China to Europe, let's say. You know, things become internalized in a way that they wouldn't otherwise, and they become supportive of national regulation that kind of aligns across the board.
I think that's fascinating, and actually I think it reinforces a big theme that's come out of this conversation for me, which is about really getting an understanding of the channel by which different asset classes can affect the real world. So that's been enormously insightful, and thank you very much. It's been a great conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks, Tom.